what our body can do.
Yeah, well, see, now you're depressing me.
Just blame the wasps, huh?
Really, universities have kind of destroyed Spinoza, in my opinion, or like the sort of let's do a history of metaphysics rundown, and then everybody is sort of summarized in these vague apodictic categories that don't
But that's what we do.
don't. Yeah, I shouldn't have used the word vague. Vague is nice, but apodictic categories is definitely the way in which universities destroyed a history of philosophy.
Oh, God damn it. Where's my stupid fucking
Wait a
password
minute.
for this crap?
Bats, you know you have to be able to dance your Spanish. Like, if you can't flamenco, you better be able to samba, man, or at least boogaloo.
Fuck.
I'd be surprised. You can't shimmy? I've heard dancing is actually, like, kind of bigger in Europe. At least for, like, men, right? Like, regional dancing.
All right, I'm going to change this to Anti-Oedipus.
Like, in the U.S., as a guy, you can...
It's 3.6, right? We're on 3.6? Are we 3.6?
Oh, I don't know, man. I just took a guess. Hey, we are on 3.6.
All right, just changing the stream's title.
I'm 1 for 2 bats.
All right. Slowly getting this going. In theory, we should be doing okay. Let's get Craigbot in here and start the event up and get moving. Oh, people. God, this place is packed. Look at you people. Why is the event not up right now?
No, it is.
Nope.
Huh. It's Discord bugging out, man.
Discord every fucking time, man.
Remember last time we messed with it?
I know.
Yeah, if we screw with it, it's gonna mess up next week.
Yeah, it always does. Fucking goddamn every time. All right, let's get Craigbot in here.
It was actually fits last time. I don't know what. I don't know what
now
changed.
Recording.
I don't know. It's fucking Discord's a shithole. But hey, it's the best shithole we've got. What can I say?
That's a good way to start the recording.
Yeah, just the way it works. Fucking Discord every time. All right.
See you, Wyvern.
Yeah, well, let's kick this off and get moving because we've got a lot to discuss today. We're going to be getting into some hilarious Orientalism that's going to be difficult to talk about, and other things that sort of have a basis in Marx and sort of don't, and other things that are going to be even more confusing because we are doing our continuing reading here at the Quarantine Collective of Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari as we move through 3.6 and we talk about the despotic socius. Good Lord, this is going to be a whole thing. It's going to be a whole thing. I have us on, this PDF is fucked up, 194, sort of in the middle. It remains to be said that if anyone has us in a different spot, now would be the time to speak or forever hold your peace. Otherwise, I will share my screen and we will just get moving into it.
No objection from me.
All right. Let's see. Do I want to go over what we went over last week? No, I'm just going to start here. Go ahead. Go for it if you want.
If I object, does that make it subject to me?
Okay, I'm going to go. That's it. It remains to be said that in order to understand the barbarian formation, it is necessary to relate it not to other formations in competition with it temporally and spiritually, according to relationships that obscure the essential, but to the savage primitive formation that it supplants by imposing its own rule of law, but that continues to haunt it. It is exactly in this way that Marx defines Asiatic production, A higher unity of the state establishes itself on the foundations of the primitive rural communities, which keep their ownership of the soil, while the state becomes the true owner in conformity with the apparent objective movement that attributes the surplus production to the state, assigns the productive forces to it in the great projects undertaken, and makes it appear as the cause of the collective conditions of appropriation. The full body as socius has ceased to be the earth. It has become the body of the despot himself, or his god. The prescriptions and prohibitions that often render him almost incapable of acting make him a body without organs. He is the sole quasi-cause, the source and fountainhead and estuary of the apparent objective movement. In place of the mobile detachments from the signifying chain, a detached object has jumped outside the chain. In place of flux selections, all the flux converge into a great river that constitutes the sovereign's consumption, a radical change of regimes in the fetish or the symbol. What counts is not the person of the sovereign, nor even his function, which can be limited. It is the social machine that has profoundly changed. In place of the territorial machine, there is a mega-machine of the state, a functional pyramid that has the despot at its apex, and a mobile motor, with the bureaucratic apparatus as its lateral surface and its transmission gear, and the villagers at its base, serving as its working parts. The stocks form the object of an accumulation. The blocks of debt become an infinite relation in the form of the tribute. The entire surplus value of code is an object of appropriation. This conversion crosses through all the syntheses. The synthesis of production with the hydraulic machine and the mining machine, the synthesis of inscription with the accounting machine, the writing machine, and the monument machine. And finally, the synthesis of consumption with the upkeep of the despot, his court, and the bureaucratic caste. Far from seeing in the state the principle of a territorialization that would inscribe people according to their residence, we should see in the principle of residence the effect of a movement of deterritorialization that divides the earth as an object and subjects men to the new imperial inscription, to the new full body, to the new socius. They come like fate. They appear as lightning appears, too terrible, too sudden. That quote at the end there, some lovely Nietzsche, always. There's just so much to go over, isn't there? Again, we're making our move into the new socius. One of the things that you see a lot with people as they make their way through this, or as they're talking about things socially, as they talk about sort of, the despot or a few other elements is more the state and the creation of the state. These things are part of this. But very specifically, what Deleuze and Guattari are bringing out here is the move that Marx actually made from, we'll say, primitive production to what he was really calling, I don't even know if he used the term Asiatic production, but state production, sort of a larger scale, top-down sort of view of things. How it opens here, it's important to understand sort of how these things move and how these things interact with the barbarian formation, the earth as the socius, the earth as the quasi-cause, tribes in very localized areas, their own, entire territory. They produce and they do things based on very specific coded hard line rules of things, codes of things, the meaning of things, but it's directly in line with where their desires are. They're producing what's right there. What the earth's providing, what the earth can provide. They're this back and forth. It's why the earth is where everything is inscribed, but also the quasi-cause. It's the thing that gives all. The state moves into a different place. JK, real quick, if you could just mute. Sorry. The state moves into a different place here, and it's very specifically around the despot that this happens. But we have suddenly this entity that's able to take on these communities, that's able to take over them while leaving them in control of their territory. I say with very skeptical language, because this is the idea. The state becomes the owner of conformity with the apparent objective movement that attributes the surplus product to the state. Oh, all of you, lovely, you keep doing what you're doing, but your surplus now belongs to us. We will now extract excess, and we get to define generally what excess is as we do this. The controls for this seem to leave the tribe, seem to leave the local barbarian formation in place, but it's not quite the case. Suddenly everything is going external. Suddenly this is where they begin talking about Asiatic production, this higher unity, this sort of meta unity that exists with the despot or the state in this place, takes these and assigns sort of goals, assigns setups, makes it appear that the despot, who is sort of setting these up and taking them, somehow becomes the cause of the collective conditions of appropriation. They are the reason that you're giving to them, is the reason you're giving to them, is the reason you're giving to them, kind of continuous self-fulfillment. This shift is where we see the despotic come and start to find itself come to bear on production. And this happens across the board. This is not just, oh, it happens socially. This impacts everything. And through this paragraph, they begin sort of outlining the steps, ending with the line about the Aryans, that Nietzsche has, about how they come like lightning. He uses this quote in a bunch of different books, but it's about sort of that really odd way that the civilized man impinges on or takes on these smaller tribes, while seemingly leaving them alone for a little bit, but sort of not. And we'll break down more of it, but that's kind of my semi summary. JK, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question. So does that mean that the body without organs is something that is malleable, and that it could, be anything that it does? It is by the whoever's has the power to dominate the situation.
So I'm hesitant to say, so it's maybe specific wording that I'm going to sort of come at you with. It's not that he's the body without organs, or that there's the body without organs. It's the way that they talk about a body without organs is as part of the productive process. The way that the socius, for example, worked prior, the earth, was the full body of the earth. There's a totality to it. It had sort of its own productive elements. A full body of the socius moved and changed to become the body of the despot, this odd thing. And this part of this, and it's this really weird thing that starts to happen. It's one of the big shifts. They have this line here: the prescriptions and prohibitions that often render him almost incapable of acting make him a BWO. The despot rarely does things. We have a fantasy as we tell stories of kings who issue wild edicts and things like that, but it's not so much the case that they're this like completely free being doing whatever they want, unbound by all. The reality is the prescriptions and prohibitions that exist stop him from really acting, or sort of being, he is as this thing, this quasi-cause, this source, the objective movement, this godhead. And this change and setup shifts him into the position of being, because he can't really act, because he's not really doing things. He's more a place where meaning may play, or other things sort of act. He doesn't act. He becomes a BWO. Right? If that makes sense. He becomes a body without productive organs. He isn't really acting. He isn't doing anything. It's happening around him. The organs of other elements, the other productive elements, are almost making him. The pressures, the intensities, the sort of influences in all different directions are more or less producing him and producing the state. And so he falls back on production. He falls back on and becomes the quasi-cause for all these elements. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, so it would be correct to say that the body without organs is a contingent entity?
It's part of the process of production. It's an element of production.
All right, great, thank you.
Is that fair, Jack?
Yeah, to kind of build on that. Yeah, so it's part of the three syntheses, right? The part I'd be careful with is, and we kind of talked about this last week, right? Like it's not so much like power in like a master-slave dialectical form. In fact, at this point, they're not even really at power per se, but yeah, to the point of the question, like an A can be a BWO, right? But the only way an A can be a BWO is when it does what a body without organs does, right? So it has to be the master of disjunctive syllogism. It has to be the provide the surface by which the territories are constituted, right? And that's the kind of thing you're seeing here with the despot, right? Um, the other thing that's tricky is like, so that line about the person, right? It's not about getting at the person themselves or even their function, they say, which is really interesting, right? It's getting at what is going to constitute that surface for social production, right? What's going to be that master of disjunctive syllogism, like Brooks got at too, right? What's going to fall back on production, because the harder you try to lean into a person, you know, remember like the example of Cardinal Richelieu and King Louis with the umpteenth, right? Cardinal Richelieu can simulate King Louis and do a lot of things, right? And this is one of the spirits of perversion they're talking about. It's always tricky to kind of nail down the despotic because of um, that side of it, and because the surface, as you're seeing here, right? And this is going to be a theme. There's a kind of, I don't want to say a transcendent above, but there's something kind of above that they're discussing here that we'll flesh out as we go.
Yeah, I mean this is the push they're making. Again, when we talk about the consumption or the production of things, we really do need to, as it says here, you need to consider these sort of formations of production, really by juxtaposing them. They say ultimately it's not with the barbarian formation, we might look at it and go, oh, well, tribes are in competition with each other. So you have, there's this kind of meta story between these tribes, which is something that a lot of ethnologists and people even today sort of talk about. It's not really the point, and it's not really how it worked, because those things were far more complex than just having sort of a larger meta relationship between the two. With the barbarian formation, they were very much under their own power, and they sort of consumed their own production. They went through this process. They had their way of sort of expanding the excess. It was not a closed system, but it was, how to put it, sort of its own thing. And this is what their opening was. It's necessary to relate it not to other formations in competition with it temporally and spiritually, according to relationships that obscure the essential. This would be saying, oh, you have the barbarian formation against other types of barbarian formations. No. That's junior shit. Instead, you need to relate it to the savage primitive formation that supplants by imposing its own rule of law, but that continues to haunt it. This is how Marx talks about agiotic production, the higher unity of the state. This is this higher thing that is coming up where we're talking about, oh, all of this is actually all ours. You get to keep your space. You can keep your cute power dynamics in your space, but we're coming in and just sort of subsuming it. And at this point, we make our move to the despot. And again, it doesn't have to literally be a despot. There's states that did this that had all sorts of sort of semi-organizations, but the body of the despot, the final godhead, or the god who's the top, as he says, the full body has become the body of the despot himself, or his god. There's a lot of different ways that these things form, but the basis is this element becomes the sole quasi-cause, the source, the fountainhead. And this is a big move here, important to go through. In place of mobile detachments from the signifying chain, which would be the blocks of debt, or how meaning moves mobily detached from this sort of change. Instead, a detached object jumps outside. In place of the selections of flux, suddenly all of it converges into a great river, a singular river that constitutes the sovereign's consumption. A radical change of regimes in the fetish or the symbol, how meaning and the production of meaning happens. The big deal here, as he says, what counts is not the person of the sovereign, nor his function, which can be limited. It is the social machine that is profoundly changed. In place of the territorial machine, there is a mega machine of the state, a pyramid that has the despot as its apex, this immobile motor, with the bureaucratic apparatus as its lateral surface and its transmission gear, the villagers at its base, serving as working parts. This is suddenly what we would call it now a superstructure exists with all of these tribes, all of these smaller areas, all these different things functioning. And instead of, oh, it's them in competition, no, the state comes in, the despot, and all comes through him. No longer are you placed on this XY graph they were talking about with the filiative and the alliant, where you have this, and here's where you go, and here's plus or minus this, and we figure out who can marry who. No. All flows through. All is passed through the body of the despot. This changes how meaning works entirely, because suddenly we have this thing that is outside of that sort of, as they call it, the outside the chain, this detached object, this unique thing. We're going to be coming back to it because it's kind of an integral part when we think back to the paralogisms. But this is the big deal. Suddenly the stocks form the object of an accumulation. The blocks of debt become an infinite relation in the form of tribute. The entire surplus of code is an object of appropriation. Everything now has this secondary little bit, this little thing, all goes through the despot, and there it is. And this works through all of it. This is basically changes how production works entirely. It's the thing that claims all of it, as you might say.
Pausing there and just jumping back. So just to focus on what is arguably too long of a sentence, but
Thank you.
Oh no, it's a couple sentences. So yeah, we get that what counts is not the person, the sovereign bit, right? And that the sovereign itself, their function can be limited, right? So it's not like it's not the Leviathan per se, right? And this is the part I want to really hone in on, because this is where we're going to get what the socius kind of is here, but also kind of two distinctions for it. It is the social machine that is profoundly changed, right? So it's the socius that's changing. In place of the territorial machine, there is the so-called mega machine of the state, right? So this is the state taking over for what the earth was. So in terms of creating the territories, right, that's one way we're going to be able to talk about the state. So what does that kind of, and it is kind of a visual, what does that kind of look like, right? It's a functional pyramid. So in this sense, right, we have a way in which the state, it has a kind of form here, right? But it's a form that is itself functional. So it has to do something, right? So notice that on one hand, we have the socius as something that's, just kind of sort of non-productive, right? And in that sense, it doesn't do anything, but it does handle the disjunction, right? And it does appropriate the surplus. On the other hand, we have a way in which that as the despotic socius is distinguished here from the state in terms of the state doing the territorialization, right? And we're seeing then the sense that as far as that form goes, right, the pyramid itself includes the despot, includes the bureaucratic apparatus as a surface, right? So remember we talked about the surface being integral for what constitutes a socius or what constitutes a BWO, right? The bureaucratic apparatus constitutes that surface, right? The surface of the despot. and its transmission gear, and the villagers as its base, serving as its working parts, right? So notice they're also defining the multiplicity here, right? The connective synthesis. So following that, right, we start to see how the state has this role similar to one of the roles of the earth, right? And yet the despot itself plays a role in conjunction with that, right? And that's one of the tricks in reading this section is understanding how those perspectives work, because they work in tandem.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that makes it tough. Arachne asks, does Marx write about this besides Gundry's? It. I don't think. Again, there's a lot of different translations. I've personally sort of shied away from anytime Marx has used the term Asiatic mode of production because it's deeply Orientalist. It is as sort of the way he talks about it goes. It's this idea that, oh, look it over there in Asia, those places haven't ever changed. This is how they do production, and that's not really the point. Instead, I think Asia and Europe, because if we take a look, you can see the way that these even sort of occurred, this transition occurred inside of any of these places. China over the last 200 years, I think or 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years really is an extraordinary story of how you have lots of smaller, rural, almost tribal elements that are brought to bear underneath the state. But it's not that China's the only one doing that or India is the only one doing that. We can have this discussion about Germany. We can have this discussion about Russia. We can have this discussion about pretty much all the states, almost like we all sort of started in a different place. So, there's some of that. But again, the other reason I'm hesitant to sort of go deep into Marx here is for Marx and a lot of people who ran after him, the conception really was less about how production operated here, and instead the focus on the idea of going from one singular entity to another singular entity. It's like, oh, look, we were primitive tribal. So you get like anarcho-communists or even anarcho-capitalists who talk about like these little tribes, and then they talk about the state. And it's, oh, the state's just a really big, it's like, no, these things don't work the same. They're not the same. And that's really what they're driving at when they sort of mention it. And when they're going to talk about it again, is they want to sort of move away from this idea of, oh, it's just a state. It's a big thing. It's like, no, there's a lot more happening. The shift from the local sort of mobile blocks of debt to these large, massive blocks of debt, as well as being sort of under the yoke, even though you have some of your own power. The reality is the despot has flatly naked power over every one of these groups. It's not the same sort of fluxy, flowy, interesting, nuanced thing of the way that even the earth and the theater of cruelty handled things, where relationships were sort of complex and contingent. No, things are whatever the fucking despot says or his people. It's unabashed power, like flatly brutalized power. And that's one of the things that they really want to make us understand as we go through this, that it's not just a shift in, oh, well, look, it's just a really big tribe now. We got a lot more people. It's like, no, you have actually still have a lot of small tribes, but now they're under the yoke of this larger tribe. And this is why he ends with the Nietzsche line, and I'll reread the end. Far from seeing in the state the principle of a territorialization that would inscribe people according to their residence, which would be how some talk about this, we should see in the principle of residence the effect of a movement of deterritorialization that divides the earth as an object and subjects men to the new imperial inscription, the new full body, the new socius. Instead of staying and keeping things local and going, well, they also have this now. We need to understand the movement that happens here. We need to understand how the power dynamic shifts and how this changes things. Arachne says, the Orientalism in Thousand Plateaus destroys how great that book is. It is a shortcoming. Also in the French, it's not as bad. The English, I mean, this is just true of French in general, but for sure for Deleuze, you can say the original French isn't as bad, and it's Orientalism is a challenging thing for all these people, honestly. It's tough.
Not get too too caught up in that right now, though.
It's a good
I
thing to
want
get caught up in. Sorry, it is. It's an
to,
interesting thing, but go for it, Jack.
yeah, I want to pull us back to the state here. So, again, notice that this is delineated, right? Um, so the state, so one of the main themes in this paragraph, and Brooks touched on this, right? This is one of the most important things here. The despotic is not understood through like, competing kind of tribalism, right? So it's not like Judaism reacting to like Egyptian uh, regimes, we'll say, right? It's not about regimes reacting to regimes in the general sense of those words. It's about how the despotic interacts with the earth, socius qua socius, right? Purely in terms of social production. One of the important things about the state here, um, notice involves people, right? And notice that the state does involve villagers at its base. So this is not to say like, the people in the country are outside of the state. This is to say they are actually, in a sense, constitutive of the state, right? And this, I think, is going to be important as we go for understanding how the inscription works, but also for understanding what the socius is and what the state is here. Because in that sense, it. If anyone, I know you've seen it, but Seven Samurai, right? It's not as though the villagers in that movie would be outside the state, and that only the samurai kind of belong to the state. It's that following this argument, right? In their own ways, everybody in that flick is kind of constitutive of the state from a viewpoint of social production, right? And only from social production's viewpoint, which is why it's kind of tricky here. But the inclusiveness is both reassuring and perturbing.
Yep. I linked to, if you want, it's a pre-capitalist formations of production. Pre-capitalist economic formations from Marx is where he discusses sort of in depth a lot of what we're talking about. And again, there's a huge amount that they're taking from Marx here because Deleuze is super, super Marxy. And Marx's sort of handful of stanchions of where things are at and how these things operate to get to capital is not far from this. They're doing a different thing with it, and I think taking it in a very, very good way. But it's worth reading. It's very short. It's very short, and it will sort of get you through a good amount in a tight way of what they're discussing here, I think. All right. Next paragraph, unless there's questions. Anyone? Anyone? Excellent. The death of the primitive system always comes from without. History is the history of contingencies and encounters. Like a cloud blown in from the desert, the conquerors are there. Quote, in some way that is incomprehensible to me, they have pushed right into the capital, though it is a long way from the frontier. At any rate, here they are. It seems that every morning there are more of them. Speech with the nomads is impossible. They do not know our own language. End quote. But this death that comes from without is also that which was rising from within. The general irreducibility of alliance to filiation, the independence of the alliance groups, the way in which they serve as a conducting element for the political and economic relations, the system of primitive rankings, the mechanism of surplus value, all this already prefigured despotic formations and caste hierarchies. And how does one distinguish the way in which the primitive community remains on its guard with respect to its own institutions of chieftainship and exercises or straitjackets the image of the possible despot whom it threatens to secrete from within, from the way in which it binds up the symbol, a symbol that has become derisory, of a former despot who thrust himself upon the community from the outside long ago? Is it not always easy to know? It is not always easy to know if one is considering a primitive community that is repressing an endogenous tendency or one that is regaining its cohesion as best it can after a terrible exogenous adventure. The game of alliances is ambiguous. We are still on this side of the new alliance, or already behind it, having fallen back, as it were, into a this side of that is residual and transformed? Related question. What is the feudal system? We are only able to fix the precise moment of the imperial formation as that of the new exogenous alliance, not only in the place of formal alliances, but in relation to them. I know where we get stuck on this every time, but we're going to make our way through it. Going into this, it's opening up talking, pretty simply, honestly, about the idea of, it ends the previous, oh, look, they're coming from external, these horrifying statists and this despotic perverts making their way in. Oh my God, how do they do this? It's like, yeah, they do. They come from without. There's contingencies and encounters. The conquerors are there. They're waiting. But it's not only from without, it's rising from within. The way that the prehistoric or the primitive formation, the earth, socius, operates, has issues. It isn't a perfect flowing system. There is no perfect flowing system that just miraculously, utopian wise, balances everything. There's a lot of challenges. And within that system, there's the issue of alliances can't be reduced to filiation. They necessarily have to be separate. They have to be wholly independent, and creates a lot of problems. It creates a lot of problems. As they say, the way in which these elements serve as conducting elements for political and economic relations, the system of previous rankings, the mechanism of surplus value, all of this is problematic. And all of this is really prefigured despotic formations and caste hierarchies. This already exists. It's not the same thing, but the machinery is sitting there waiting for this stuff, and it's boiling. It's ready. It is problematic, and they don't really know what to do with it. You can't do much with it. You just kind of keep going. And the question would be, well, then we have, how to put it? Because he's sort of referencing a lot of Griel's writing here when he's talking through tribes that were sort of, I don't want to say uncontacted, because that's not a thing you can do, but when studying tribes that made their way back out or were part of despotic formation or any of these things, there's a really strange thing. How do you distinguish the way in which this primitive community remains on its guard with respect to its own institutions of chieftainship, and then exercises the symbol of the despot, this external thing that is this threat? How do we consider that? How do we understand that as a thing? The reality is they're kind of, it's the reason it's confusing. They're kind of look a lot the same. They kind of work very similarly. It's not exact because of the way production operates, but they have a chief. They have higher class people. They have sort of relations based on these mobile debts that, well, don't create perfectly equitable everything. This isn't some kind of egalitarian communist paradise. There's weird shit going on. People from this side of the village, or people who'd been there for longer, they have more control over things because of the way this mobile debt relations works. Or the chief. How do we distinguish this? How do we play with this? And it's really tough to sort of do that. It's not easy to know if one is considering a primitive community that is repressing a tendency, or one that is regaining its cohesion as best it can after this exogenous adventure. There's this really interesting interplay. Again, he's trying to get away from the idea that it's these machineries started somewhere and then built. It's the way the original machine was working, the original socius, combined with the sort of contingent encounters that they may have with others that are also not working super well. And we end up in this really odd place. The game of alliances is ambiguous. Are we still on this side of the new alliance, or are we already beyond it, having fallen back into a this side of that is residual and transformed? Where's the line? How do we know it? How can we ever tell? We can't really. because ultimately we can only ever fix the precise moment of the imperial formation, the despot showing up, as that of a new exogenous alliance, not only in the place of former alliances, but in relation to them, to those former alliances. So it's almost we can't know the changes happened until it's done kind of thing. I really like the phrasing around that. Arachne asks, I am using PDF Gear, which is an excellent little program. Just a PDF reader. But you can edit and do all kinds of fun shit in it.
Building on some
Please,
of these
please, go.
concepts. Okay. So again, right, what marks the new socius, right? To understand the new socius, we can't look at like changing regimes, like, how does Christianity react to Judaism, right? It's not about them reacting to each other. It's about what the despotic does to the earth, right? It's about how social production interacts with itself, right? That's what marks the change. So in that sense, right, like this internal external language, it's similar to the internal external limit language, right? Which, if you'll recall, has a lot to do with the disjunctions, and it gets at incest, and it gets at how that affects production, right? So in a sense, that's kind of the theme here, right? Part of what those limits do is they affect production, and in that sense, they affect production so much it can affect what the socius can become, right? And that's kind of this point about like, this is a theme throughout Nietzsche's the coming, right? In this sense, what was coming was the despotic, right? Or at least that's what happened. But it's not divorced from what's happening with social production in the earth, right? Because again, it's about how social production interacts with itself, what the despotic does to the earth, and kind of vice versa, actually. But so that being said, there's just one thing I wanted to focus on here, and that's this point about that this death that comes from without, yep, the general irreducibility of alliance to filiation, right? So this is one of the challenges with the limits in the Earth's socius, right? Social production basically crosses the limit, so to speak, or kind of bridges the limit through extension, right? And that's kind of the falling back on. So that's the movement from the ambiguous to the plus or minus, right? Or the plus minus minus plus, that ambiguity to an exclusive disjunction. Probably a better way to say that, right? The independence of the alliance groups, the way in which they serve as a conducting element for the political and economic relations. So remember, the alliance plays arguably two roles of nothing else, right? It's a critical part of the disjunction, right? It's kind of our horizontal axis, the lateral side, and it's the extensions, right? And then on top of that, it plays a role in repression, right? So we're getting into the conditions now for how the earth and the despotic get into this relationship, right? That's really what's going on here. And they delineate that just a little bit here. The system of primitive rankings, the mechanism of surplus value, right? This prefigures the despotic and caste hierarchies. So notice in that sense, right, what's at hand in the earth, right, is going to be, in a manner of speaking, at hand through change in the despotic. So we're taking the syntheses, right, and in a manner of speaking, we're talking about how they alter.
I mean, does that make general sense to everybody?
Can I have ask another question?
Of course.
There, so in the beginning, there was the desire and production in interaction or conflict with the body without organs, right? And that would be the territorial uh, in the beginning. But then out of that conflict and interaction, there develops the socius. And then is that the progression? The socius then gradually, how does the socius, and that interaction, that synthesis develop into the spotic? Is it the
So the
So,
the the transformation of these things kind of comes in a couple different ways. It's from without and within, and they're not really given primacy or causality to either of those. We need to consider the primitive formation, the socius of the Earth. Let's just say that this first socius we've been going over, consider it as a whole series of social machines, and within these social machines there are a lot of, we'll say, issues and things that become difficult in sort of the way that they operate, that necessitates a lot of sort of behaviors and expulsions and all kinds of things. But these incongruities, similar to how sort of Marx talks about the natural progression of things due to their own sort of internal issues, we're not wildly far from that sort of thinking when we're talking about these primitive elements that we're playing, the way that rankings operate, the way that political and economics work, the way that the chieftain plays his role. This thing that they're doing and that they're constantly fighting against, which they're aware of, this sort of all power coalescing into one person, which these tribes all constantly are fighting against. It doesn't take a lot for them to just fail to fight against that, is kind of how this works. Like, they're all doing these things, and this socius, the what claims production in a series of possibly contingent events, internal and external, suddenly this movement happens where instead of these mobile blocks of debt, instead of being very contingent and particularized, suddenly the alliant and the affiliative are cast through one person who claims it all for themselves. This game of alliances that played suddenly becomes direct. We are able to see that because ultimately the imperial formations of that new exogenous alliance, the way that a tribe deals with another tribe instead of the traditional sort of alliant fuzziness, suddenly happens. But it's not so much that it takes it over, but it's specifically how, in relation to those alliances, another relation takes place. And this is the thing to sort of be focused on. Two tribes may have an alliance, this thing that would just happen in under the Earth socius. You have, that's great, yay, we're gonna do this. Here's how we're trade people, trade donkeys, whatever the fuck we do. But then there's another alliance in relation to that relation, and that is this new thing that has popped up. This it may be the chieftain of a tribe decided to do this. I have no idea. Like, it doesn't really matter. But something happened that places another single person, this despot, this god, in relation to that relation. And suddenly the alliance is due to them. The alliance, and when I say due, I mean in every way. The alliance is owed through that despot. They're the ones who created it, as far as anyone is concerned. They're also the ones who keep it going. They're the ones who determine what happened. Like, they control production, this relation of these other relations. And this is the shift that they're wanting us to make and understand, that it's not just, oh, alliance has happened. It's like, no, it's the alliance has happened and another alliance, this new alliance that's a relation of relations, which is that ending of the paragraph. Does that make sense? And Jack, go ahead. I know you were wanting to jump in.
um, yeah, so be careful about the territorial machine, like just how you're using the phrasing there, because the way you want to the way I would suggest kind of approaching it, right, is you have desiring production, social production in relationship to each other, right, and that's the inclusive disjunction by which this book kind of operates, and by which universal history. It's one of the reasons it's possible, right? Because social production, desiring production, are intimately close in the first two socii before before they become limits for each other in capital, right? And I won't go too much deeper into that because that would take us back to 3.1. So in that sense, right, social production, desiring production are already in relation to each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's shifting with the despotic is just that it's basically that the earth provides the conditions for which the conditions of production can change. So the way that the syntheses function, right, and the way those limitations are imposed, right, that's what they're right now underlining as making possible not only the conditions for production in the earth, but by extension, uh, the despotic, right? So the conditions in one socius actually contribute to the conditions in coming socii, even if they haven't come yet, which is, that's why it's kind of Nietzschean.
Did that help at all, JK?
When you said it kind of Nietzschean, are you talking about the overman that separates itself from the herd, and then is that overman the despotic?
Just the theme of what's coming, right? So like they appear as lightning appears, too terrible, too sudden, right? It appears from without, but there's this sense of something arriving. So like this is kind of the theme, right? Is like the coming, especially in terms of a change, is in part possible by what's at hand, right? What's already here makes change possible, even though whatever comes might be something totally different by which the previous is no longer quite possible. That's why the earth kind of haunts the despotic here. Notice it's not the despotic haunting the earth. So just in the theme of the coming, I'm speaking. Not so much like the Ubermensch and the, like the fourth socius, but more generally.
Great, thank you.
And just so it's on audio, Arachne asked about what text that earlier bit was from about the external conquerors who do not know our language. It's from Kafka's Great Wall of China. Fantastic little short story, as Bats said. Bats has a note I want to make sure we hit on. I'm going to read it and then we're going to critique it. Just be ready for that, Bats. Some things which occur to me unsure how much sense they make. The despot, by claiming production, benefits from the fight being drawn out, benefits from the system being taken to its extreme and thus production delving deeper. Another thing that comes to my mind is the miraculation in a similar way to the capital. To the similar way capital gives the impression of being the source of value within, with the despot not really doing much, but seemingly being behind, being the ground in a way, different social relations. Let's take that in two parts. First off, we have to be careful when we say the despot claims relations, because the despot doesn't do that. That presumes that the despot is producing that. The despot is the BWO in this sense, is the socialist, is falling back on. They're not claiming relations. They're falling back on relations. A slightly different interaction. Claiming relations, it could be taken as this is mine, or I'm the one who made this. Claiming. Whereas falling back on, as they've talked about with the BWO, the way that, we fall back on our own self and we say things like, oh, I'm hungry. I've fallen back on the production of that feeling. I've made that my own. The despot falls back on. And it's not something that they have to necessarily even do. Just being the despot or having that sort of godhead point for anyone underneath them, the subjects of this person, the people who live the way that they consider it, for them, production has also had this experience happen. They've all had it fall back on. So that would be the first thing. Jack, you agree generally there?
Yeah, I mean, you've always got to be careful when you're talking about a socius, right? Because it's not it's never going to be like a sentient being, right? It's not like a person calculating things. It's irrational.
Yeah.
The thing I'd add to that, like it's tempting to read it's tempting to read the kind of universal history here in terms of like social progression stages of production, to borrow an economical term. Not one exclusive to Marx either. Quite a few have used that. I think Fredericks did, but anyways, or like like class struggle itself, right? Notice that the critical point being made so far in the section is more about how social production conditions itself, in a manner of speaking, both as it's producing, but also in terms of how it can fundamentally change to the degree that the social body shifts, becomes something different, right?
Yeah. And the second bit is the term that comes to mind is the miraculation. In a similar way to the capital, gives me the impression of being the source of value. Source of value. I mean, is the source of all, the source of meaning, the source of value, the source of production, the source of all of it. Like it's a falling back on production makes the godhead. You think you are hungry. A child thinks that it wants breast milk. I want that. I've decided I want that. Then we've fallen back on and claimed that production for ourselves. So it's we've everything. It's everything. The source. I guess that would be how I'd phrase it. Let's get on with the new alliance then. Oh, I may have to get up and get a water in a second. This new alliance is something altogether different from a treaty or a contract. What is suppressed is not the former regime of lateral alliances and extended filiation, but merely their determining character. They subsist, more or less modified, more or less harnessed, by the great paranoiac, since they furnish the material of surplus value. In point of fact, that is what forms the specific character of Asiatic production. The autochthonous rural communities subsist and continue to produce, inscribe, and consume. In effect, they are the state's sole concern. The wheel of the territorial lineage machine subsists, but are no longer anything more than the working parts of the state machine. The objects, the organs, the persons, and the groups retain at least a part of their intrinsic coding, but these coded flows of the former regime find themselves overcoded by the transcendent unity that appropriates surplus value. The old inscription remains, but is bricked over by and in the inscription of the state. The blocks subsist, but have become encasted and embedded bricks, having only a controlled mobility. The territorial alliances are not replaced, but are merely allied with the new alliance. The territorial affiliations are not replaced, but merely affiliated with direct filiation. It is like an immense right of the firstborn over all filiations, an immense right of the wedding night over all alliances. The filiative stock becomes the object of an accumulation in the other filiation, while the alliance debt becomes an infinite relation in the other alliance. It is the entire primitive system that finds itself mobilized, requisitioned by a superior power, subjugated by new exterior forces, put in the service of other ends. So true is it, said Nietzsche, that what is called the evolution of a thing is, quote, a succession of more or less profound, more or less mutually independent processes of subduing, plus the resistances they encounter, the attempts at transformation for the purpose of defense and reaction, and the results of successful counteractions. Such a good line from Nietzsche. As in line with what I was saying at the end of the previous paragraph, where it's like, this isn't about the replacement of the old system. This isn't a wholesale throw out the old now, on Tuesday, and then, Wednesday morning we wake up and there's a new system in place. All new parts. It's like, no. You still got all that shit. Actually, most of that shit stays there. You still have these people still get married. They still have alliances. They still have to work somewhat together. Like, these things still are in place. It'd be silly to say otherwise. But how they operate and how they become sort of taken is the big point. As we talked about, two tribes may work together. Great. They have an alliance. They're familiar with each other. But now there's another relation to that relation. That relation actually controls, almost conditions that other relation. This is the relation with the despot. The despot, by enabling and saying, oh, just almost by saying, sure, you guys can have that alliance. Oh, excellent. But that alliance isn't theirs. That's the despot's. He is allowed, like, it's the thing. It's the power in place that enables these other things. The ability for someone to have birthed a child, the ability for someone to get married, the ability for someone to do work, these tend to stay there, but they don't exist or work in the same way. Instead, now you have this new thing, this odd shift of controlled mobility of these blocks of debt and inscription that suddenly are fully there and fully allied and filiative with this despot, this new relation of relations. This changes really how all of this functions, even though it sort of doesn't. And that's the part that is kind of the underlying thing. This is, Marx talked about this as well, that it's not that we've like completely broken off and it's completely different than it was. They want us to realize that it's not that. It's not at all this. The ending here with Nietzsche, it is the entire primitive system that finds itself mobilized, requisitioned by a superior power, a super system, subjugated by these new exterior forces and put in the service of other ends. As Nietzsche said, the evolution of a thing is the succession of more or less profound, mutually independent processes of subduing. First the repression, then the resistances, the transformations, and the counteractions. This wonderful sort of happening of things. But it doesn't mean the systems will go away. It doesn't mean there's some new parts. It's all different. It's a good paragraph. It's a pretty crisp one.
Yeah. Always love a good Genesis reference, right?
It always helps.
Yeah. So to expand on this, right? So again with the terms, right? New alliance versus alliance in a more general sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like alliance extension in that, right? Because it's about, once again, how the inscription of the despotic interacts with the inscriptions of the earth, right? And this is where we're getting what they mean by haunting, right? That the earth haunts the despotic. This paragraph is kind of getting at that, right? Like this idea of subsistence, right? That it's kind of floating out there, but still active, or I guess I shouldn't say active so much as functional, right? So overcoding relies, in a sense, on an interaction with coding, right? The new alliance relies, in a sense, on its interaction with alliance. So notice that there's a relationship that's being expanded here in terms of how social production functions for the earth, having become a madhouse, and how social production functions for the despotic here.
Yes, it's a way I've described it, and I've started more pushing towards this, I think, because the language is tough when we start talking about this. It's almost, you need to be thinking about it as almost an extra dimension to it. And it's because there is a mathematical sort of version of this where you have a line between two things. That's great. That's wonderful. And then, there's like this network stuff, the lines sort of exist. When all of those are then also appropriated by another relationship, it's not that those lines go away. It's that there's another line drawn, this new line towards this new alliance. The other alliance is now conditioned by its relationship to that, and also vice versa. Like all of these things, again, work together as part of this larger system, but the old lines are still there. So if you were to just look down, you go, oh, look, see that line's fucking still there. These guys are still friends. Yeah, but there's this new dimension to the relationship, this new alliance of alliances that sort of plays this sort of meta role in taking on these things. And by doing so, it puts itself in this position of power and control where it is the thing that made that alliance in the first place. The other relationship, it's the thing that allowed that relationship to exist. Arachne, we were talking about the Spinoza line, don't really know what a body can do. This is not far from that same sort of thing. When we talk about the relations of elements, we go, oh, my leg is attached here. It's like, okay, cool, you've got that line. Then we're aware of the sort of meta line of us as a person and a subject, and we think that line is really the thing. And we kind of keep moving to these sort of new meta relationships that sort of exist, but we've forgotten, like, really all of these pieces are still moving. They're just now empowered in a different way. They're now controlled in a different way. They're now considered in a different way. And by doing so, that we've kind of disservice is the wrong word, because we're going to be getting into again how this sort of meta relationship shifts yet again when we move to capital. But it's really important to understand here that it's the relationship of relationships, the alliance of alliances, the filiation of filiations. This is the one that sort of connects upwards, and this other dimension gets added that subjugates it entirely. Even though it may still be there, you can still point at it. It's not really the same thing as having a chief in a tribe, because that's not really what the chief did. It's not really how things were decided. It's not really how meaning was made. Now it is. Now it is. If that makes sense.
To kind of emphasize some things there, it's that interaction though, right? Because the despotic is still interacting with the earth. So the kind of codes in the primitive, right? The debts, the disjunctions, whether at intention, whether at the intensive or the extensive, right, are still going to be in relationship to what the despotic is now inscribing, right? Because I think one of the things that's kind of critical here is, as they say, the old inscription remains, but is bricked over and over by and in the inscription of the state, right? That it's, on one hand, right, it's like building a wall, hence the Kafka story, but it's also like part of that Earth's inscription is going into that brick, right? So if you think of making bricks from clay, it's kind of the same analogy. Because one thing I want to emphasize is that insofar as we are talking about power, right, it is still irrational, and it's relational, right? So again, like, the state includes the peasants, as we saw earlier. Hope I don't get screen capped for that one. The state includes the peasants.
No, it'd be accurate, and it's important to. It's important when talking about these things to really just be very clear about how we're discussing, because when we start getting into later things with capital, one of the things that is going to continue through is how the paranoiac works, or the despot in this case isn't a person of total freedom. Like, we have this fantasy that we aren't free, but someone at the top probably is somewhere. We promise there's freedom. Capitalism, it lies like that, but the despot is the same thing. There's this idea that the kings were free to do anything they wanted. And I think history has shown that that's fucking silly, because the moment they did anything, the world reacted, and very often it would react poorly. Depending, again, the way that these things operate is not just simply this sort of simplified unidirectional nature of a relationship of power, but it's the relations of the power relationship to other relationships that make this, which is, again, it's complex, but it's tough.
Yeah, notice this language, right? The territorial alliances are not replaced, but are merely allied with the new alliance, right? As though a new use of the disjunction is being had here. The territorial affiliations are not replaced, but are merely affiliated with the direct affiliation, as though we're just kind of taking two x-axes or two y-axes and putting them in a relationship to each other, right?
Does this make sense to people? You good? All right. It has.
Before we move
Oh, go for it. Good timing.
I've gotten good at it, man. Okay, the affiliative stock becomes the object of an accumulation in the other affiliation, while the alliance debt becomes an infinite relation in the other alliance. So, right, like we've talked about how the finite debt is becoming infinite um, in the primitive or in the despotic, right? I just want to point this out again that look, um, the affiliative stock here taking on accumulation, right? So like we talked about how inventory is kind of changed in the despotic because inventory is now accumulative, or it's accumulating, or it's kind of aggregative, right? It's summative. Um, there's a kind of expansiveness through it that I think is coming through with the sense of the infinite rather than the finite. And you see that kind of mirrored in the alliance, right? While the alliance debt, so right, the debt on the primitive, the debt on the earth, becomes an infinite relation in the other alliance. Notice the use of becoming there, right? The debt created on the earth becomes this new, so just use the words credit, right? Becomes a credit in the despotic socius.
It has often been remarked that the state commences or recommences with two fundamental acts, one of which is said to be an act of territoriality through the fixing of residence, and the other an act of liberation through the abolition of small debts. But the state operates by means of euphemism. The pseudo-territoriality is the product of an effective deterritorialization that substitutes abstract signs for the signs of the earth and that makes the earth itself into the object of a state ownership of property, or an ownership held by the state's richest servants and officials. There is no great change from this point of view, when the state no longer does anything more than guarantee the private property of a ruling class that becomes distinct from the state. The abolition of debts, when it takes place, is a means of maintaining the distribution of land and a means of preventing the entry on stage of a new territorial machine, possibly revolutionary, and capable of raising and dealing with the agrarian problem in a comprehensive way. In other cases where a redistribution occurs, the cycle of credits is maintained in the new form established by the state: money. For, without question, money does not begin by serving the needs of commerce. At least, it has no autonomous mercantile model. The despotic machine holds the following in common with the primitive machine. It confirms the latter in this respect: the dread of decoded flux, fluxes of production, but also mercantile flux. That's interesting. He uses the word mercantile flux there. I have issues. Of exchange and commerce that might escape the state monopoly with its tight restrictions and its plugging of flux. When Etienne Boulez asks why capitalism wasn't born in China in the 13th century when all the necessary scientific and technical conditions nevertheless seem to be present, the answer lies in the state, which closed the mines as soon as the reserves of metal were judged sufficient and which retained a monopoly or a narrow control over commerce, the merchant as functionary. I'm gonna dive into my French version. I'll be right back.
Yeah. So while you're looking at the French, so just to kick this off, right? So I mean, the joke they're playing in the beginning, right, is it's not a benevolent state. Um, again, it's not quite the Leviathan. It's not quite social contract, right? It's not quite those kind of standard tates, right? Um, because those are euphemisms, right? Or like, reframings of things in a manner of speaking. Or as they say, it's a pseudo-territoriality, right? So it's like a fake intensiveness that is the product of an effective deterritorialization that substitutes abstract signs for the signs of the earth and that makes the earth itself into the object of a state ownership of property, or an ownership held by the state's richest servants and officials. So just focusing on that for a moment, and I'll give the floor up. Right, so this point about the deterritorialization, right? So this is about how the despotic is affecting the earth. This point about abstract signs, right? This is kind of that theme they're getting at in terms of like something above, something external, right? You can think of writing here, and in fact, it's kind of where they're going, right? There's something mental to the physical, and in that sense, that's kind of what they're getting at here, in the same way Marx talks about price, right? Price is something that's kind of mentally considered and then applied to the physical, right? In a similar sense, um, that's kind of how these overcodings work. It's a little bit more than that because saussures happen, but we'll deal with that when we get there. More poignantly right now, notice that the relationship they're giving is that, so in that sense, the deterritorialization of the earth by the despotic, right, is going to make the earth into a kind of object for the state, or an ownership held by the state's richest servants and officials. So notice we're getting two different ways, once again, that the kind of, the kind of socius can function in relationship to the earth. And in that sense, it kind of appears to us um, as ownership of the earth, right, or the land, like we saw with the peasants earlier, maintaining kind of, property or earth ownership for farming or something like that, right? So just a recapitulation of that point, but, taken a little differently. But as promised, I'll give it to somebody else now. Or I guess, does anybody have any questions on that bit so far? Just how the deterritorialization works there? Okay. I guess just pushing this along then. So at this point, go ahead.
Oh, can you
JK.
elaborate on how money is used, and is that talk about money? Is it like a sign for debt?
At, at this point, they're talking about it through like the accounting machine, the way they're talking about it um, in terms of the writing machine, right?
We're
So
we're not
so
we're not there yet.
finances.
We're not there yet. Like we will be there, but I think it's they have entire sections on just that. I'm hesitant to jump into saying they're saying that yet because I want to stick as much as possible to the paragraph or what's already been said, because if it's they're going to be doing a lot of things, but like what they're talking about specifically here, I'm hesitant to say is them diving right at writing and all of these things. It's instead, to me, the way that they're talking about money, which in this case we're talking about like a gold coin stamped with the face of Caesar. We're talking about that kind of money, not capital, which is different. We're talking about printed money. We're talking about coin money, but it's the translation of this the one sentence I think can be better translated, but they're saying like, look, go for it, Jack, before I do that.
Before you go into the translation, though, so this is where I'm pulling it from. This is 195. The synthesis of inscription with the accounting machine, the writing machine, and the monument machine.
Right.
So, like, that's all they've said about it so far, right? So, in that sense, they're just talking about it through inscription, right? The same way they're talking about writing at this point. So, it's like part of overcoding. Go ahead, Brits.
So the translation, the way that they translated this, I think makes it more complex than it needs to be. And they have some words in here. The thing right before this, the line, for without question, money does not begin by serving the needs of commerce. This is kind of where I want to sort of start the discussion. Because the service of commerce, this idea that money was made to help people trade more easily, is a refrain that's used very often in historical things or colloquially. And their argument is like, no, that's not what it's here. That's not really its point. It's not really what it does. Instead, to just re-say it, the despotic machine has this in common with the primitive. And this confirms it in this regard. The horror of decoded flows is kind of how the dread of decoded flux. We're talking about the flux, decoded flux, the way that things become hard coded inside of the earth and the territorial machine. The move to the despotic, we're not getting rid of that. We're shifting how coding works and sort of how meaning is made, but we're still staying there because we can't get rid of these hard coded ways of things. That we can't have the horror, the socius feels a horror of decoded, the decoded flux, of the flux of production, also the flux from the merchant, which deals with exchange and commerce, which would escape the monopoly of the state. Its grid, his stamp, is the original. I don't even know what plugging of flows fucking comes from. That's not in this fucking sentence at all. The thing that's happening is the state, again, with money being in this position, is about keeping codified control over alliance, keeping codified control over these the flux, the signs of things, the code of things, because nothing can escape this. The state must maintain total control of all of it. When you exchange something for another, you should be doing it literally with the despot's head on a gold coin, because that keeps his eye or his watch or himself in that involvement. Again, when we talk about the alliances and this new alliance that he's talking about, the alliance relationship that manages other alliance relationships. If I enter into a barter with you and I exchange some money, that can't happen on its own. That's fucked up. That'd be really bad. The state can't have that. So instead, they want you to use the gold coin with the king's fucking head on it. This is about making sure that people are knowing that this exchange is happening through this other relation, that the other relation is here. This is what they're saying at the end here when they talk about Balaz talking about the history of China. And he's absolutely right when he says, why did capitalism not pop up there? Well, when you look through the history of China here, and Francois Julien does a good bit of this too, it's actually very accurate, not just China, but I think a lot of long-running states that existed in sort of a despotic place had, you might say, the foresight to understand, to limit themselves, to control these things, to, hey, we're not going to just empty all the mines of all the gold and just get this ridiculous secondary fucking explosion of value. No. Instead, as soon as we have sufficiency, we stop. As soon as we can control things, until we've got to maintain control. That's all that matters. It's always control. And you can see this example throughout like an extraordinary amount of time. And you can also see where this failed and where capitalism began to sort of poke its head in, where they didn't have this kind of control, or you could say self-discipline, which was a big deal, especially in a lot of countries, about the king having this kind of discipline, or the area having discipline, this control over commerce at this level. Because again, capital is not this. This is money. We're talking about money. Money is not the same thing as capital. This is the state's version of money, if that makes sense. I'm hoping that ramble helped at all.
So you're saying that capitalism is actually a development that leads to, freeing up the uh, the economy, right?
Oh, we'll
Or
get there. I don't want to jump to capitalism yet because it's a completely different thing. Well, there is no economy here. That's one of the things to remember is like economy doesn't exist as a thing at this point. We can talk about it now and like looking back on it and go, oh, well, look, there was an economy of fucking this or that, or China's economy in the 2nd century. But economy, as we're talking about, is like a very, very complex set of secondary relations that this is not at. This is the despot, all being done through him, all his alliant affiliative lines being involved in all. And so, again, to go back to what Jack was saying, when we go back and we're saying that the bricks of mobile debt suddenly are cast over, they're still there. These debts are still, these blocks are still there, but now there's a hard coding to it. There's a different way of handling it. These things are still going, but they work differently. And again, this is not capital yet. Also, why do they have the thing with its tight restrictions and plug and flows? That's sort of what they're saying, but that's not a translation. That's an explanation of what they're saying. Very strange. I find that very strange. Because it's such a great ending, the poetic thing. Its grid, his stamp. It's the whole point is the stamp of the despot. Because they use that reference again later. It's such a strange translation. Very frustrating. Sorry.
No, you're good. I mean, yeah, so going back to money. I mean, yeah, so the way I would approach it is through inscription, right? So in that sense, like, I would be careful. I would say there is an economy, but there is not a capitalist economy here, right? And you can see that in like, it's a monopoly, right? A state monopoly at that. But it's not capital, right? Like Brooks is saying, and it's not capitalism. It's money under a different, completely different condition.
Yes.
But in that sense, right, like what money kind of does here, and if you notice Deleuze and Guattari, right, so they're putting a relationship with debt, right, and they're saying in this sense, money is kind of revolution. It might be revolutionary, right? It's a stage of a new territorial machine, possibly revolutionary, and capable of raising and dealing with the agrarian problem in a comprehensive way, right? In other cases where redistribution occurs, the cycle of credits is maintained in the new form established by the state money. So, so just this would be the kind of where I'm heading with it. So in that sense, right, like money's developed here as part of the inscription, and in this sense, like notice its credits in relation to debts,
Mm-hmm.
right, and it's tied to this point about it's almost this joke about the benevolent state, right, as though the state forgives debts. What it actually does is kind of appropriate them and put them in relationship to credit, right? And money is just one of the ways it does that. It can be through writing too. It can be through other things, as we'll see. But in all cases, it'll be inscriptive.
And if you want to, Belaz's the great bureaucracy, the godly bureaucracy. I can't remember the translation of it. Wonderful book, but also Deleuze mentions as the footnote in this, or no, of course not. If you want other great readings, would be Godelier's book on the mode of Asiatic production, which is pretty much spot on. He talks about it not just as an Asiatic thing, though. He branches it out and he talks about this sort of economic systems like this that existed in Africa, where his specialty was, and again how these very particular relations operate between tribes, within tribes, and how money is used here. And that's again the big thing to talk about, money. So let's talk about money, the next one. Anyone have any questions, comments on this before I keep moving? Because I want to just keep powering through. Are we aware of the intention of the emphasis of how debt or becoming constitutes blocks or bricks? Do they found this on empirical research? Because, of course, they mean really it's a brick, not a metaphor. Um, so, uh, so blocks is much more in line with the original, as you know. They use bricks kind of interchangeably. A lot of this has to do with relating Marx's conception of production to the unconscious, and again, having these productions sort of have similar language. That's how I understand that they do that. So they use a lot of comments around this to make us sort of be able to grasp the production of the unconscious, the machinic unconscious, in much the same way we would if I was talking about blocks of wood or metal or bricks.
Don't
But
have too much to offer there, but
may be
just as
wrong,
a
but that's
final,
my understanding.
oh, got me. Um, but yeah, just on this point about just this last bit of the paragraph as we're moving into money, as you said. Oh boy. Um, so like with this, notice that the way the despotic machine and the capital machine, the two soci are being differentiated, right? It's kind of twofold. One, it's staving off decoded flows, and two, it's in how they use the, at least in this paragraph, how they use inscription, right? And that's really important because this is the difference between money being used by the despotic in that sense, and later on capital being used, capital using itself really to do decoding, right? And that's kind of the differentiation that's hitting there.
I think that's fair. All right. The role of money in commerce hinges less on commerce itself than on its control by the state. Commerce's relationship with money is synthetic, not analytical, and money is fundamentally inseparable not from commerce, but from taxes as the maintenance of the apparatus of the state. Even where dominant classes set themselves apart from this apparatus and make use of it for the benefit of private property, the despotic tie between money and taxes remains visible. Basing himself on the research of Edouard Will, Michel Foucault shows how, in certain Greek tyrannies, the tax on aristocrats and the distribution of money to the poor are a means of bringing the money back to the rich and a means of remarkably widening the regime of debts, making it even stronger by anticipating and repressing any territorialization that might be produced by the economic givens of the agrarian problem. As if the Greeks had discovered in their own way what the Americans rediscovered after the New Deal, that heavy taxes are actually good for business. In a word, money, the circulation of money, is the means for rendering the debt infinite, and that is what is concealed in the two acts of the state. The residence or territoriality of the state inaugurates the great movement of deterritorialization that subordinates all the primitive filiations to the despotic machine. This is the agrarian problem. The abolition of debts, or their accountable transformation, initiates the duty of an interminable service to the state that subordinates all the primitive alliances to itself, the problem of debts. The infinite creditor and infinite credit have replaced the blocks of mobile and finite debt. There is always a monotheism on the horizon of despotism. The debt becomes a debt of existence, a debt of the existence of the subjects themselves. A time will come when the creditor has not yet lent, while the debtor never quits repaying, and for repaying is a duty, but lending is an option, as in Lewis Carroll's song, the long song about infinite debt. A man may surely claim his dues, but when there's money to be lent, a man must be allowed to choose such times as are convenient. It's a fucking good line, by the way, from Carroll. And I always say Michel Foucault hilariously because I made the mistake of saying it fucked up once and someone gave me a lot of shit. So now I'm a jerk because they're French and it's funny to me. So you're going to have to deal with that. So there you go. All right. Where do we go start from here? So first, let's pull back. A good book on money, if you want, is Marx. So he wrote this big book on it called Capital. Suzanne de Brunehoff, following this, wrote Marx on Money, which is a very lovely summation and very brilliant sort of way to re-summarize his take that money and capital are not the same thing. So let's make sure we're not talking about capital here when we talk about it. The way money works in commerce, it's not about how it works really in commerce. It's more about control by the state. It's its primary, real functionary sort of place. This relationship that trade has with money, that commerce has with money, is synthetic. It's not an analytic relationship. It's not hyper complex. It's actually pretty simplistic, and ultimately money itself is separable from trade. We can pull it up. I can trade you stuff without having money as an intermediary, but state apparatus needs that tax. We got to have that little bit. We got to know how much we're taking out. And even where we have, what does he say? Even where dominant classes set themselves apart from this apparatus, makes use of it for the benefit of private property, the despotic tie between money and taxes remains visible. It's always there. Michel Foucault shows how in the even Greek tyrannies, the tax on aristocrats and the distribution of the poor was a way of bringing money back to the rich. You see this in American discussions where you actually have conversations about how much money is made, what's the ROI on investments in homeless care, in housing the unhoused, in getting care for drug addicts, anything it may be, because they frame it in terms of, and they're very aware of, that money invested in such a way comes back to the overall economy, which makes the rich richer. The money comes back. It's not immediate. It's not, hey, cool, this unhoused guy who's got a house is going to come give you $50. It's not how it works. But overall, this sort of happens to be the thing. This shifts. Now, why is this the case? Like, why does this work this way? Well, Foucault talked about it and said, ultimately, what it does is, I want to get the phrasing specific right. The tax on aristocrats, the distribution of money to the poor, are a means of bringing the money back to the rich and a means of remarkably widening the regime of debts, making it even stronger by anticipating and repressing any re-territorialization that may be produced by the economic givens of the agrarian problem. The agrarian problem, as they've been talking about so far, runs into what is happening here pretty head on, but the ability for us to have the state take taxes, pull it out, and now actually sort of recommence these things and bring it back. The space that debt can happen, where debt can occur, the people who can have debt placed on them widens. To say bluntly, in a modern version of this, homeless people don't have credit cards. Kind of would be the simplest way to put it. Although that's probably not true anymore, but like, you don't loan $10,000 to a person who has nothing. You loan to someone who has something, so that way you can get that something, or you can sort of take advantage of that. The space that the regime of debts can take place needs to constantly widen, making it stronger. And it does this. Money does this. This is what money does. So it is the means for rendering this debt infinite. The previous debt, where I would give you something, you'd give me something, we'd go back and forth, and it's kind of a game, still happens. Very much an American Midwest thing rather than an American West or East Coast thing. It happens throughout the world. It's like, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. Here's a really nice bottle of wine. Now you fucking owe me. That setup that is sort of made, this changes this. Now with money, this debt is now infinite. It's not just an exchange for us. There's a third party involved. This is concealed. This is what happens in these transactions. The two acts of the state, as they say. First, you have the territoriality, residence of the state, which gives this movement of deterritorialization, subordinates all primitive affiliations to the despotic machine. This is the agrarian problem sort of as a thing. Then you have the abolition of debts or their accountable transformation initiates a duty of an internal service to the state that subordinates all private alliances to itself. You and I use dollars to buy things. That debt is to the U.S. They're all debt notes. Like they literally are all debt notes. You should look at them sometime. All money is debt notes. We're exchanging debt notes America gave us. We're subordinated to that system. We're subordinated to that alliance. It always goes back through this. This is the problems of debts. Suddenly we have this infinite creditor and infinite credit that have replaced those blocks of mobile debt that were contingent and difficult and kind of odd. And also on top of it, it's a debt because it's everything at this point. This is the affiliative and the alliant. It's really a debt of my existence. All the subjects. And this changes things because again, and it's the line I love here, a time will come when the creditor has not yet lent, while the debtor never quits repaying. Boy. Well, this is absolutely things that are happening today. The odd place that you see this happening especially is inside of the despotic regimes where someone could be paying off. I mean, this is what starts the story of fucking Sherwood Forest. This is Robin Hood. This is every one of these fucking stories from these kings who their sheriffs or their priests or their mayors who are like, oh, look, you owe, we gave you this land to have a field. You're paying us back for that forever. And I don't ever have to loan you anything again. I don't have to do shit because I'm the lending is an option, but debt repayment is an obligation. It's an amazing difference between the two that is, again, central to the concept of money. Not capital yet. We're not at capital yet, but money, which is a part of capital, but we're not at capital yet, so don't ask about it. There you go. That's my long ramble on this. Please go for it. Jack, got anything?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so again, like it's, yeah, money through inscription, right? Where this paragraph is kind of interesting is it's going into money still through inscription, but also in terms of voluptus or subject, intensities that contribute either to territorialization or to subjectivity, right? Very broadly speaking. So where I'm getting this is like this point about taxes, right? Taxes, the maintenance of the apparatus of the state, right? Where I read from earlier, right, in terms of the machines, page 195, right? Tribute is the machine of consumption, right? And so that's kind of where we're getting in this paragraph is how consumption and consummation work in the despotic, but also how, in a manner of speaking, the circulation of money, right, as a function of inscription, deterritorializes the debt from the primitive, right, while also staving off a reterritorialization from the people closest to the earth, more poignantly speaking, right, from the earth kind of constituting a finite debt, right? Because that would be, that would really be at odds with creating infinite credit, wouldn't it? Right? And that's kind of the interesting thing about this, right? From the standpoint of kind of the abstract or the mental, right? Um, the kind of more physical, um, yeah, just more generally, right? The kind of more physical side of it, the signifiers, if you will, right? Insofar as they haunt, they take on this kind of not so much an abstraction, but they take off this kind of loftiness to them, right? That's what's really curious about this is the signifier haunts the signified. Um, Not to go too deep into what's coming, but we're already starting to get the pieces of it here. To get one more theme out, and then we'll give the floor. basing himself on the research of Edouard Will Michel Foucault, shows how in certain Greek tyrannies, the tax on aristocrats and the distribution of money to the poor are a means of bringing the money back to the rich, right? So the distribution, redistribution, right? Second synthesis. And a means of remarkably widening the regime of debts, making it even stronger by anticipating and repressing any reterritorialization that might be produced by the economic givens of the agrarian problem. I already alluded to the last part of that, but notice how, again, there's this sense where, kind of looking in that kind of pyramid of the state, right, that kind of triangle, right? The question of inscription is one of movement in that triangle, so to speak, right? So that even upon the body of the bureaucratic apparatus, right, the aristocrats can still be subject to taxation, right? And in fact, all of this kind of works so that the the kind of debts that keep getting promulgated, right, take on infinite credit. So in this sense, right, like if you think about debt as like a finite owing, right, a credit is a kind of finite lending. And this is the kind of tension both between the despotic or I'm sorry, between the earth and despot socii, um, and between like inscription itself that they're really drawing out here, right? That this little carol poem kind of gets at. I'm going to talk a little bit more about subjectivity, but before I do that, does anybody have any questions? Anything you want to go over before we get into subjectivity? You guys are seeing the agrarian problem, right? Delineated in terms of like the primitive filiations, the despotic machine, right? How do filiations regarding the earth get refiliated with the despotic, right? So it's not even just the agrarian in terms of the people on the land, but more generally, right? Anybody who has some sort of affiliation with the land, right? Or more poignantly, right? A debt in connection to the earth. Hence, like the raw material language and all that, right? Okay, there's no questions. Looking at subjectivity here, so again, right? Like these points about territorialization, tribute, um, they're getting into subjectivity in this paragraph, right? And not for too long, but just enough to underscore or underline a few things here. So again, going back to the agrarian problem, right? This tension between the primitive inscription and the despotic inscription, which poses a new problem for the despotic, right? Which is reterritorialization, right? A reterritorialization from the earth, so to speak. Deleuze and Guattari continue. The abolition of debts or their accountable transformation initiates the duty of an interminable service to the state that subordinates all the primitive alliances to itself, the problem of debts, right? So in this sense, notice that it's again this point about change taking place through the inscription so that the debts can be turned into credits, right? Or as Deleuze and Guattari say, right, by abolishing the debts, you might think of like a Jewish jubilee here, right? Every 50 years we wipe out the debts. Not to pick on Judaism today, but it's at least the first example that comes to my mind. Um, in that sense, Deleuze and Guattari are saying that kind of abolition has a function, right? And it has a function in terms of taking the debts and initiating them into an interminable service to the state, subordinating all the primitive alliances, taking the debts in relation to the earth, those finite blocks, and creating of them duties to the state, right? Creating new functionality to them so that insofar as the aligns the economic and the economic and political changes to be kind of reoriented to um, to the state here. So in that sense, right, notice what they're getting at is, again, infinite credit and infinite creditor, replacing the blots of mobile and finite debts, right? There is always a monotheism, not interested. The debt becomes a debt of existence, a debt of the existence of the subjects themselves. So at this point, right, kind of the thing they're leaving us with here is that subjectivity takes on the debt, right? Or rather the existence. So we might think of here kind of like what's consummated as product, right? But also in terms of subjectivity, right? The group subjects, those take on the debt, and noticeably the debt in terms of its tension between the earth and the state or the despotic, as we've just outlined, right? So that by circulating money, an infinite credit can be created, and some of the other things that we've discussed at this point. So at this point, right, like we can just kind of go to open floor, right in time for Matt's departure. Go ahead, JK.
So the subjects he's referring to a kind of like the relation between the king and his subjects.
I, I think it's less that and more subject in terms of the third synthesis. Go ahead, Brutz.
No, it's about what I would say too. It's the subjects. It's not so much. I mean, the term subject sort of comes from that original thing, but this is very much the existence of subjects themselves, and so it's kind of in reference to their earlier usages.
Right? Because remember, everybody's in that pyramid, so to speak. So, like, the king, the parliament, the democracy, right? There's subjectivity there's subjectivities functioning throughout that, not exclusive to, say, like the peasants. They can't even have that much.
Yeah, they don't even get that much. That's a fair way to
They
put it.
don't even get that.
Well, and the debt, and as it moves, and again, this is going to be a really big thing as we make our way forward. The things that this is sort of solving, and the way that this sort of interacts, again, it's important to remember the horror of the decoded flux, because it's felt here still too, because the last thing we want is desire not to be coded. It's the last thing that any of us ever want. And that's a big drive as we make our way through here, is how desire becomes coded. And then not in another way. Any last questions or anything?
So which is better, to be coded or be decoded?
Well, better is an interesting term. I would ask sort of what it produces and how it works, because it's not so much a better or worse. It's a way that desire operates and how desire codes itself into meaning and becomes things. How we are determined ultimately, how we become, how the flux of us comes. So when we talk about better or worse, it's again how it operates, because capitalism is going to have a decoded flux of desire. This is coded. All of it is not exactly great. It's not exactly great. But if we can start piecing together the parts of things, but ultimately their argument is, if we can start piecing together how one comes to desire their own repression, how desire becomes twisted around to this, how the subject is produced that does this, how these things operate, we might be able to build something different. We might be able to make a new Earth, a new alliance, a new island, a new desert, whatever the fucking phrase they want to be saying. So it's not so much better or worse. It's different, and it is, again, contingent and based upon a lot of different things.
So in terms of state control, or you know, would it be by process of decoding or coding? Is it?
State
I mean,
controls
there.
coding. The
State control coding.
So yeah. So within the Earth socius, desire becomes hard coded, like extremely so. It carved literally into the skin, into the earth. Desire is coded. You don't eat your own kill. You don't uh, take advantage or act on your desire immediately. These things just don't have. This is because desire is coded. We can't have decoded desire. It's terrifying. So we want to make sure we're able to find ways to control desire, and desire and how it produces works socially this way. If someone had decoded desire fully inside of the earth or the despotic socius, they're not involved socially. They're not. It's not a great day for that person, I think, is how I'd put it. It may not even survive significantly. Um, I would argue very much they're saying the same about now. But anyway, so when we talk about like desire and how it becomes coded, the state codes the meaning of these relationships. Prior, the alliances and filiative relationships that we had were coded effectively by the earth. At least it seemed so. Desire coded itself according to the earth. The earth fell back on the production of things. Here, the despot falls back on. So all seems like it is coded by the state. They do this through money. They do this through the alliance of alliances, the one that controls them all, or the one that all is due to. That everything seems like it's produced for or through. And this is where we're going to be stopping, because before we get into the next steps, it's important to remember we're talking about the despotic now and how the production of things happens. And that's the big deal.
So what's the difference between deterritorialization and reterritorialization? Is there a correlation with coded and decoded desires?
Be- Before we go into that, just backing up to codification. So the primitive codifies, and then the despotic codifies and over codifies. And you can see this on 196. The objects or group pertain at least a part of their intrinsic coding, right? So the earth, but these coded flows of the former regime find themselves overcoded by the transcendent unity that appropriates surplus value, i.e. the despotic, right? But yeah, just making sure we got that. Roots, do you want to kick us off on territorialization?
It sounds like something like coding. It's maybe, uh, in terms of, what kind of surface, right? Maybe one is territory and the other one is on the body or interior or the mind. Is it similar to coding?
We'll have to have probably another reading in order to go over, like, another talk sometime to go over specifically how the two are related, because it's its own entire thing. There's a couple of really good essays I'll think of. I'll ping you when I get the essays uploaded, JK. That'll probably be the best bet. How's that sound?
Great, great, thank you.
No, it's a tough one. So it sucks. It's not an easy one, and I'm not sure I'm super good at it either. So it is what it is. But we're over time. Why did we ignore your comments? We're not ignoring any comments. We love you, Arachne. Did I ignore comments? I thought I read most of yours. We love you, Arachne. You wrote in response to this. There we go. Decoding and coding is not analogous or correlative with deterritorialization and territoriality. One situation, a body might become deterritorialized, enter into a mode of being coded, and reterritorialized, enter into a mode of being decoded, vice versa. These two series are distinct. The easiest way to understand a sense of this is to individuate all units of articulation distinctly. This is why I said we would need to do another fucking reading, by the way, because it is really complicated, and they're not disconnected, like unrelated, but they're not correlative either. So, yeah, we'll get to it. Now, Arachne, we fucking always read your comments. I'm busy. Sorry. It's been a long day. But with that, I'm going to bounce. As always, love you all. We'll see you next week. Same time, same place. And at some point, I will annoy everyone with some pings to look up and find the relationship and play with the two, coding and territoriality. Otherwise, we'll see you all next week.